So psychopathy is learned, and I think one of the other things was that what we're seeing are actually childhood coping mechanisms showing up in adulthood. So I'll begin there. I think absolutely that could be the case. We know that childhood is so important and that adverse childhood events show up in adulthood, sadly often associated with poor mental health and other things as well. And so that could be what we're seeing. But I also think that there's likely to be a problem with the labeling there, because that's a coping mechanism. It's not psychopathy. I wouldn't label it as that. I say it's a trait that may look similar, but it's to do with coping. And there is a problem with the diagnostic criteria and how we label and discern psychopathy. Let's then go back to other factors in childhood. In terms of psychopathy, there is research to suggest there's a genetic factor involved as well. Now, I'm not fatalistic enough to believe that someone, or I don't want to believe that someone is born a psychopath with these really undesirable traits and they go off down that path. What I do think could be the case is that some people are genetically susceptible to certain environments that may cause them to go that way. And I am 100% certain, 99.9, that epigenetics is at play. In a stressful, anxiety-filled environment, then gene expression can change. We may see early neurobiological difference, which would explain why when we look at the brains of some people given the label psychopath, there appear to be differences in things like function and connectivity. So there's more than one thing going on. I think it's shades of grey. I think it's multifactorial. And so is psychopathy learned? Yes and no. I think the coping part and how they present in adulthood is learned. But I think it should be labelled differently. I'm very dubious of some of these labels anyway. I think they're dangerous. I think there's another component which is probably more cemented in genetics. Should they be labelled that way? I don't know. I mean, there's a whole debate about that anyway. So I think there's probably two things. Could there be a crossover and a mixture? For sure. But is a coping mechanism in the mix? I'm certain it's in the mix. Then let's talk about the study that showed that surgeons had a higher level of stress immunity. Now, they were saying, the authors of the study, that was a good thing. And I agree. That's a good thing. It's really important for a surgeon to have a high level of stress immunity. But does that mean that every surgeon has high levels of stress immunity? I think it probably does. It probably means that the majority do. But does that mean that they're all so-called psychopaths? Absolutely not. Not remotely. Not remotely. And when we look at the recent news about the problems with the surgical teams and the bosses, then those people, those leaders causing that misery and horror may not be psychopaths at all. Some of them may be psychopaths and they're not doing anything wrong. They're great bosses. But some could be deemed psychopaths with low empathy, etc., and high levels of stress immunity, and are causing chaos. I just think it's interesting to note that in terms of the general population, surgeons tend to have a much higher level of stress immunity, and with stress immunity, that trait sometimes comes these other traits that are connected to psychopathy, but not necessarily. And I think that can be the issue with a psychopath. When a psychopath is in charge and is not a good boss, is a toxic boss, what I think we're seeing there, particularly in roles where you need high levels of stress immunity, is that high level, but also in the mix comes callousness, disregard for social norms, other people's feelings, etc., etc. And it is that mixture of psychopathic traits in a position like a surgeon, or indeed in other organisations and teams, where it becomes toxic. But psychopaths as such are not necessarily toxic at all. A lot of them are really good people. A lot of them do a lot of good. A lot of them perform incredibly important functions, partly because they have this high level, or can have this high level of stress immunity. Some psychopaths are criminals and do horrible things, but the majority are not. Anyway, I hope that makes some sort of sense, and thank you very much for your version of that, your thoughts on things, because it really helps unpack what I think is an extremely important topic and an extremely important area to keep on thinking about, particularly those labels and how we categorize and how we discern who is what and who isn't.